The Cold War is often remembered as a standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union, a clash of ideologies that never erupted into direct confrontation. But beneath the shadow of nuclear deterrence, real wars were fought, lives were lost, and nations were reshaped. These hidden conflicts became the battlegrounds where superpowers tested their strength without ever openly declaring war on one another. In the dense jungles of Vietnam, the Cold War turned into a blood-soaked struggle. American troops faced the Viet Cong, backed by Soviet weapons and Chinese support. Villages became battlegrounds, skies roared with napalm strikes, and rivers carried the weight of untold casualties. For Washington and Moscow, Vietnam was more than a war. It was a message to the world that communism and capitalism would not share the same ground. For the people who lived there, it was survival in the middle of global rivalry. Far from Asia, in the deserts and savannas of Africa, the Cold War left its mark. Angola descended into chaos as rival factions tore the nation apart. The Soviets armed one side, the Americans and their allies backed another, and Cuban troops marched thousands of miles to fight in a land not their own. It was not about Angola itself, but about influence, control, and the spread of ideology. Soldiers fought in villages surrounded by red dust, aircraft thundered overhead, and civilians bore the cost of a war that was never truly theirs. In Afghanistan, the mountains became the graveyard of Soviet ambition. When Moscow invaded in 1979, they expected a swift victory. Instead, they faced fierce resistance from Mujahideen fighters, armed with grit and eventually supplied with American Stinger missiles. The valleys echoed with explosions, helicopters fell from the sky, and Soviet troops trudged through unforgiving terrain that refused to bow to their power. The war dragged on for nearly a decade, draining the Soviet Union until its strength fractured from within. Even in Korea, long before Vietnam and Afghanistan, the Cold War had already proven it would spill into open battle. North and South Korea became proxies for global powers, with the United States and its allies facing off against Chinese and Soviet-backed forces. Soldiers clashed across mountains, frozen rivers, and shattered cities. The war ended in a stalemate, but the scars it left still cut across the Korean peninsula today, a reminder of how the Cold War's hidden wars never truly ended. These conflicts were not hidden to those who fought them. To the soldiers who bled, to the families who mourned, and to the nations torn apart, they were wars as real as any in history. Yet in the shadow of nuclear standoff, they were treated as side theaters, footnotes in the grand rivalry between two superpowers. But their impact was immense. They reshaped borders, toppled governments, and left deep wounds in societies that still struggle with the legacy of a conflict the world called a cold, but which in truth burned fiercely on countless battlefields. Proxy wars became the defining feature of the Cold War's hidden battlefields. Rather than risk a direct clash that could escalate into nuclear war, the United States and the Soviet Union chose smaller nations as the grounds where their rivalry played out. These conflicts were not fought for land alone, but for influence, ideology, and the right to shape the future of the world. Villages, jungles, deserts, and cities far from Washington and Moscow became the arenas where the Cold War turned hot, and it was in these proxy wars that countless lives were lost. Vietnam stands as one of the most striking examples of this strategy. What began as a fight for independence from colonial rule turned into one of the most brutal chapters of the Cold War. The United States saw Vietnam as a line in the sand, a place where communism could not be allowed to spread. The Soviet Union and China saw it as an opportunity to challenge American power and support a communist ally. American bombers rained destruction on jungles and villages, while Soviet-supplied weapons kept North Vietnamese forces fighting with resilience. The jungles of Southeast Asia became soaked in blood as soldiers and civilians alike were caught in the middle of a war that represented not just a local struggle, but a global one. The United States eventually withdrew, but the scars of that proxy war endure in the land and its people. In Korea, the Cold War's logic of proxy conflict was already clear. After World War II, the Korean peninsula was split in two, one side backed by the United States, the other supported by the Soviet Union, and later by China. What started as a civil conflict exploded into a full-scale war, with American troops and their allies battling against waves of Chinese soldiers and Soviet advisors. Towns were obliterated, families divided, and soldiers fought across frozen rivers and mountainous terrain. Neither superpower could claim outright victory, and the war ended in a stalemate that still holds today, with a heavily fortified border marking the line between North and South Korea. That frozen front line remains one of the most dangerous legacies of the Cold War's proxy wars. Africa, too, became a chessboard where the Cold War was fought indirectly. In Angola, after the Portuguese withdrew, rival factions turned the nation into a war zone. The Soviets and Cubans poured resources into one side, while the United States, along with South Africa, backed the other. Angolan villages became training grounds, battlegrounds, and graveyards for soldiers from faraway lands. Cuban troops marched through African soil thousands of miles from home, while American money and weapons fueled resistance movements. For Angola's people, this war was not about ideology but survival, yet they were pulled into the orbit of a global struggle that had little concern for their future. The Middle East also felt the weight of Cold War proxy conflict. In places like the Arab-Israeli wars, superpower involvement turned local rivalries into international flashpoints. The Soviet Union armed Arab states, while the United States supplied Israel. Every clash, every battle was more than just a regional war. It was a test of strength between Moscow and Washington. The deserts of Sinai, the streets of Beirut, and the skies over the Golan Heights all became part of the Cold War's unspoken battlegrounds. What linked these conflicts was the way superpowers used them as testing grounds for ideology and weaponry. The Soviet Union supplied rifles, tanks, and advisors, while the United States deployed soldiers, air power, and financial aid. Each war became a message. Communism would not retreat, and capitalism would not yield. Yet behind this ideological struggle, it was ordinary people who suffered most. Entire generations in Vietnam, Korea, Angola, and elsewhere grew up amid fire and rubble, caught in wars that were never truly theirs. Proxy wars gave the Cold War its heat. They allowed the superpowers to fight without ever clashing directly, but the cost was immense. Villages destroyed, nations fractured, and millions of lives lost became the hidden toll of a rivalry that called itself a cold. For the United States and the Soviet Union, these conflicts were about pride, ideology, and influence. For the people who lived them, they were battles for survival in a war that had chosen their homelands as its battlefield. The Cold War's hidden wars were often dismissed as regional conflicts, overshadowed by the nuclear standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union. Yet to those who lived through them, these wars were anything but secondary. They scarred societies for generations, toppled governments, and left wounds that are still felt today. The Cold War might have ended without a direct clash between Washington and Moscow, but its hidden wars proved that the cost of avoiding nuclear confrontation was often paid in blood elsewhere. The scars remain visible today. Afghanistan continues to wrestle with instability born from that era. Vietnam still carries the physical and psychological wounds of a conflict that devastated its land. Korea remains divided, its people separated by politics rooted in a war fought 70 years ago. In Africa and Latin America, the aftershocks of Cold War interventions echo in political struggles and economic challenges that persist long after the superpowers withdrew. These hidden wars remind us that the Cold War was never truly cold. It was fought fiercely on the ground, in the skies, and across seas far from the halls of Washington and Moscow. The global rivalry may have ended, but the people who lived through its battles carry the memory of wars that reshaped their nations and defined their lives. Their suffering, resilience, and loss stand as proof that while the superpowers avoided direct destruction, the world still paid an immense price for their competition. The Cold War may have ended without the clash of superpowers, but its hidden wars left a battlefield that stretched across continents and generations. So, from the jungles of Vietnam to the mountains of Afghanistan, from the deserts of Angola to the divided streets of Korea, the world became a stage for a conflict fought in shadows but paid for in blood. Nations were reshaped, societies scarred, and millions of lives altered forever. Buddy, What history remembers as a cold standoff was, for countless people, a war as real as any other, one whose echoes still reverberate in the scars of those lands today.